the bones came together.
All right, brothers and sisters. So this is an amazing picture, really. This picture is, these are all Jewish children. And as you can see, they are from different areas of the world. And this is a picture of Israel today. The boy on the left is obviously from Ethiopian descent, from the Ethiopian Jews. The boy in the middle is more white-skinned, probably from America or from Europe, Ashkenazi. And then I'm not sure about the boy on the right. Maybe he's Ethiopian as well. Maybe he could be from India or from Yemen, one of those places. And this is how the bones are coming together. And that's what we're going to be looking at in this class. Israel is a great place for bird watching. And the storks come through Israel on the migratory route. It's the sort of the area that they're able to come through, this narrow area, I guess, where it's not so much desert and where they can fly over land as they head down to Africa. So if you're into bird watching, a lot of people go there and do this to watch the storks. These are the migratory routes of some of those birds. And you can see the green arrows, how that they all come from so many places in the north and come down and migrate down into Africa. And in a way, that's like the Jewish people who, like a bird, were out of their area and were scattered throughout the world and were scattered everywhere. And God has brought them back again, as we looked at in our other class. Among these nations you will find no ease. And so they became a wandering people. And in Ethiopia, there was a Jewish community there. There may be some very few left there now. And very ancient origins, and a lot of people have sort of looked at it to say, are they genuine Jews or not? But the rabbis in Israel, they looked at it and said that they were Jews. They have a very fascinating history, and some people trace them to the tribe of Dan. But in the Ethiopian Jewish communities, every village had a synagogue, and they had a Torah in that of the law, and they prayed on the Sabbath. They assembled and prayed on the Sabbath. They read from the Torah. They fasted on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement. So they kept some of the Jewish feasts and some of the Jewish practices. And when things got politically very bad in Sudan or in Ethiopia, and they moved to Sudan, in 1984, 1985, in what was called Operation Moses, about 7,000 of those Jews were airlifted to Israel. And then again in 1991, in Operation Solomon, they took all the seats out of the planes and just put on as many people on the flights as they could. They moved 14,400 people in 36 hours. Absolutely phenomenal, as these people had walked through the desert in very harsh conditions, come to camps, and then they were airlifting them to Israel because they were in such a precarious situation. And these flights, this set the world record for the most passengers on an airliner. 1,088 people on one plane. But the interesting thing is that when the plane took off, there was actually only 1,086 on the flight because 2 babies were born during the flight. As a matter of fact, on all the flights to Israel from Ethiopia bring the Ethiopian Jews back, there was 5 babies born on flights to Israel. This is one of them. This is one of the babies that was born on the flight on the way to Israel. And today there's Ethiopian Jewish community in Israel, and their ancient manuscripts that they hundreds of years old, what they read from, the law, which is this, they've brought to Israel as well. And so these Jewish communities often treasured very centuries old manuscripts. As a matter of fact, the most valued manuscript of the Old Testament was in Aleppo in Syria up until the State of Israel was established. And when the State of Israel was established, there were riots in Aleppo on the Jewish community, and the synagogue was burnt to the ground, and they thought the Aleppo Codex, as it was called, had been destroyed. And then it turned up many years later in Israel. It had been smuggled out. It had been saved, but there were pieces of it were missing. It was so famous that Jews from all over the world would write to the Jewish community in Aleppo, and they would say, "We're looking at this passage. What does your manuscript say?" And they would write back and tell them what the manuscript said. So it was consulted from all over the world. And if you're ever in Israel, if you go to the Shrine of the Book, where the Dead Sea Scrolls are, in the Shrine of the Book, in the top part of the Shrine of the Book is the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you go down to the basement is the Aleppo Codex, and the two are together in there. So this is 1950-51, Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. 125,000 Iraqi Jews that were suffering persecution came to Israel at that time. And from 1989 until 2006, 1.6 million Jews from the former Soviet Union came back to Israel. And those Jews had a struggle to come back. They weren't just an easy, not that those airlifts were easy, but it wasn't like they suffered persecution and then they suddenly were able to go to the land of Israel. They were persecuted. The Soviet Union tried to erase their culture, tried to destroy their religion and their culture, as they were trying to erase religion from society in communist Russia. But the Russians were still, I guess, a bit anti-Semitic. So if you were Jewish, it still had to say you were Jewish on your identity card. So that actually preserved the Jewish people, because people would then, it said on their identity that this person's Jewish. They maybe suffered some persecution for that, and then they looked into Jewish and what it means, and it actually helped preserve their heritage. So the Jews of Russia came back. You can see the girl there playing a violin. The joke with the Jews is why is the violin the favorite instrument for Jews? And it's because it's the instrument that you can run with. So that's what the Jewish people have gone through. 1949, going back a little bit, Operation Magic Carpet. 45,640 Yemenite Jews came back to the land of Israel at that time. This is a very fascinating quote. This is from Golda Meir. Many of us will have heard of Golda Meir, who was a very active Zionist and later Prime Minister, I guess it would be, of Israel. So during Operation Magic Carpet, 1949, she wrote, "Sometimes I used to go down to Lydda, which would be Lod by the airport there, by Ben Gurion Airport, and watch the planes from Aden touch down from Yemen, marveling at the endurance and faith of their exhausted passengers. 'Had you ever seen a plane before?' I asked one bearded old man. 'No,' he answered. 'But weren't you very frightened of flying?' I persisted. 'No,' he said again, very firmly. 'It is all written in the Bible, in Isaiah. They shall mount up with wings of eagles.' And standing there on the airfield, he recited the entire passage to me, his face lit with the joy of a fulfilled prophecy and of the journey's end." Imagine that, brothers and sisters, that they kept their faith. They kept their belief in the return. In Yemen, throughout the world, they kept this idea and kept as a distinct people, and that one day they would go back to the land of Israel. And that day happened for those Jews in Yemen. The Jews of Europe came out of the Holocaust. It's absolutely incredible that a people that were so destroyed, that underwent such a fierce genocide to erase them, 6 million people killed by the Nazis, exterminated, And yet only a few years after the end of the Holocaust, those Jews were making up a nation. Absolutely incredible. Here's the, this is after World War II, and there's some very interesting documentaries on this particular movement of Jews back to the land. But these are how the remaining Jews from Europe after the Holocaust made their way, often sneaking across borders, going through mountains at night, coming down to ports on the Mediterranean, getting on ships. It was illegal then for the Jews to emigrate to go to Palestine, to Israel. The British had an embargo on that activity. So the boats would set out at night under cover, and they would head to the Mediterranean coast. Most of them would be intercepted by the British and turned back to Cyprus, and the people would be put in detention camps. And you can read about that in many different books. So there's a documentary called The Long Way Home, and if you can find that, it's very, very, very interesting to see this part of the story. But this is just one small part of the story. As we've seen, so many Jews returned from Arab lands that had suffered persecution to the land of Israel. And that's very important to notice that, because sometimes people just say, they kind of want to refer to Israel as it's like this colonialist project of Jews from Europe, right? But it wasn't that at all. It was Jews from all over the world, and many Jews from Arab lands. As a matter of fact, there were so many Jews from Arab lands that suffered persecution and had to leave that went to Israel, as many as Arabs that left at 1948 from Israel and went elsewhere. The difference is that the Jews that were from Arab lands that suffered persecution and went to Israel were absorbed into society and given citizenship and built the nation, whereas the Arabs that had left Israel were never absorbed into society. So today in Syria, in the civil war, there's still Palestinian refugee camps because they have never let those people out. They've never let them into society. They have kept them as refugees, and the UN supports them, and so they don't have to be a part of society. And I think some of those refugees are probably now are the ones that are in Europe, that have fled to Europe. So important to notice that. But a fascinating story. So these boats would come across the Mediterranean. Here's one of them. I don't think they were ever really the best boats out there, like some of the worst boats. So a few of them would make it. Then we'd come up to the coast, people would get off, and then they would blend into the population to escape from the British. Of course, the famous one is the boat called the Exodus, that you can see here, this old tub that they bought somewhere in America, took over, filled with 4,500 people, and then took it to Israel. It was intercepted by the British, and it was a very famous story. As a matter of fact, it can be also referred to as the ship that launched a nation, because it was such a worldwide, after the Holocaust, all these refugees and the way they were treated by the British really helped to turn world opinion for a moment in favor of those people, so that the state of Israel came into being. We actually met a lady who was supposed to go on the Exodus, and she had so many fascinating stories. She survived in the forests in between, near the Russian front, between Germany and Russia in the war, on her own. She was just a little girl, lived in the forests, and after the war, she survived the war somehow. After the war, she was a refugee. She was in deportation camps. And she was going to go on the Exodus. She was a group that was supposed to go on the Exodus. Somebody in their group got measles, and so they were not able to go on the Exodus. And she ended up coming to, I think, to Canada eventually. In her group, I'm getting sidetracked here, but in her group, there was a leader in the group. So there was all these orphans, because the parents had all been exterminated in the Holocaust. So there's all these orphans. So they formed them into groups. And so an older person, like an older teenager or young adult, might be over that group of children to look after them. So she had a guy that was over her group, and his name was David. And he kind of looked after that group and was responsible for it. And after she'd lived over here in the West for many years, she went to Israel as a visitor. So she had a guide that was taking her around, Jewish guide, and she said to the guide, I need to find this man, and he's called David. And the guy, of course, he's like, you got to be kidding me. This is Israel. You know, there's a lot of people here called David. So she said, no, you've got to find him. So anyway, they were going around Israel, and they went to some kind of event. And she was looking at this guy, and she thought, I wonder if that's him. And so she said to her guide, you've got to go and talk to that man over there because he looks like David. Maybe that's the man. You've got to go talk to him. And he said, no, I'm not going to go talk to this guy. She said, no, you have to. You go talk to him. So he went and he talked to this guy, and it turned out it was the same man. And she said everybody in that place was in tears because everybody was found out about the story. So many fascinating stories. And of course, in Israel, everybody has a story. You know, so many people have stories about all these events that have happened to their people. So this is 1947. Chaim Weizmann makes an appeal to the United Nations, and this is was a witness to the world that this is the fulfillment of prophecy. And Chaim Weizmann wasn't a religious man either. As a matter of fact, him and Abba Eban were in a hotel the night before the UN appeal, and they're putting the touches on the speech and writing the speech, and they want to add in a Bible passage. They didn't have a Bible. Neither of them had a Bible. So they find in the hotel room the Gideon's Bible in the hotel room, and they're searching through the Gideon's Bible and the prophets trying to find a verse about the return. And this is the verse. They find Isaiah chapter 11. And so this is the verse that was read out in front of the United Nations. And it couldn't have been a better verse because it says, and it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover his people. So we can't just take these prophecies and say, well, that was talking about the return from Babylon. Here it's specific. It's the second time that God is going to regather his people. And that's what we've witnessed happen. The second time to recover the remnant of his people, and he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And that's exactly what happened. So the UN, tried to come up with plans for peace and to divide the land. And this is the partition plan. What's fascinating about this is if you know what the Vatican would like, this is what the Vatican would like, and this is what they were pushing for at that time in 1947. Just notice Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and the whole area around Jerusalem is white. It's a different color. That's because that was to be internationalized. It wasn't supposed to be part of the Jewish state. Wasn't supposed to belong to the Arabs. It was supposed to belong to the nations, to the United Nations, and to the churches. Isn't that fascinating? And this is always what they've asked for. And then you can see what was supposed to be Jewish, which wasn't very much, and what was supposed to be Arab on this particular plan. Well, while all this was going on, the way God works, I suppose. Out in the desert, you've probably heard this story, but out in the desert there's some little boys throwing rocks. They lost their goats, right? And they were Bedouin. And they come across these caves, and they're throwing rocks into the caves, as boys do, right? Anywhere in the world, boys are the same. They like to throw rocks, right? So they're throwing rocks into the caves, and they hear something break. So they come back the next day, and they go in here, and they find these bundles with writing on. So they take them home to their parents, to the tents, Bedouin tents, and they look at this, and nobody knows what it is. Nobody can read it. They can't read the writing or understand the writing. So they take it to a shop in Bethlehem, and this is the shop that they took it to. And so they still can't really make sense of what it is. But the owner of the shop has a connection with an archaeologist in Jerusalem, a Jewish archaeologist. And his name is Eliezer Sukenik. And this is him. And he's the father of Yigal Yadin. And so he, that's him there. So he wanted to go to, he wanted to go and look at this. But this is right before the UN vote. So it's very dangerous. There's going to be riots as soon as this vote happens. Everybody knows this. So he he gets up in the morning and he tells his wife, so I'm going to go to Bethlehem today and to look at some old scrolls. They had sent him some little pieces. He said, I want to purchase them. And his wife's like, you got to be kidding me. You're not going to Bethlehem. You're staying home, Eliezer, go back to your room, right? So he's not allowed to go, so he doesn't go. But then the UN vote gets delayed by a day. It's delayed by 1 day. So the next morning he gets up and he doesn't even tell his wife, you know what I'm doing today. He gets on the bus and he goes to Bethlehem and he gets these things and he brings them back on the bus to his house. So that evening he's looking at this. It's the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the prophecy of Isaiah, right? And he's sitting there looking at the scrolls, and his son is sitting in the other room listening on the radio to the vote at the United Nations at the exact same time. And his other son, Yigal-Yadin, who was over the armed forces of the Haganah, I guess it would be at that time, he says, I cannot avoid feeling that there is something symbolic in the discovery of the scrolls and their acquisition at the moment of the creation of the State of Israel. It is as if these manuscripts had been waiting in caves for 2,000 years, ever since the destruction of Israel's independence, until the people of Israel had returned to their home and their freedom. This symbolism is heightened by the fact that the first 3 scrolls were bought by my father for Israel on the 29th of November 1947, the very day on which the United Nations voted for the recreation of the Jewish state in Israel after 2,000 years. Isn't that incredible? And it's God's hand showing the people that there is more to this. This is going in a different direction. This land is the land of the Bible, and this is the prophecy of Isaiah coming to pass. And so many things keep bringing this to the attention of people. So now whenever you go to Israel, right, anybody who goes there to the Israel Museum, here's the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. It has the story of the scrolls. And nobody could understand it. Nobody knew what it was until the people who it belonged to could look at that and say, this is given to us. This is the oracles of God in the Hebrew language. And somebody who could read Hebrew well, like Eliezer Sukenik or Yigal-Yadin, would be able to pick that up and read it. There wouldn't need anybody to decipher it. The letters haven't changed that much that you can't just read it if you understand it well. And so when he would be able to sit there and read that scroll, absolutely fascinating. So then in 1948, the State of Israel was established. And that's the Declaration of Independence. That's the Palestine Post, what became the Jerusalem Post on the day of the State of Israel being born. And in the Declaration of Independence, it says, the State of Israel will be open to Jewish immigration and the ingathering of the exiles. It will devote itself to developing the land for the good of all its inhabitants. And that was another stage in the bones coming together. And in a moment, we'll look at a quote from the Christadelphian that's how it was seen at the time, as another stage in the coming together of the bones. And here's children celebrating the State of Israel being proclaimed. But it wasn't all good at that time. Yigal-Yadin, who we just mentioned, who was over the army, said we have a 50-50 chance of making it, of surviving. We have a 50-50 chance. It was very slim. Everything was stacked against it. You had equipped armies that had nations, like the Jordanian Legion that had been armed by the British. You had the Egyptian forces, the Syrians, others, all coming against a nation who had only what they'd been able to build up before the state was declared. A lot of it would have been done illegally because they wouldn't be allowed to form an army, right, when it was governed by the British. So it was very, very difficult, very dicey. And just south of Jerusalem, there was some Jewish communities before 1948. It's an area called Gush Etzion. It's near to Bethlehem. And those communities were destroyed, and the people were massacred that lived there at the time. The very day, actually, that the declaration was read, these communities were destroyed by the Legion. So this is, you can go see this tree today. It's called the Lone Oak, and it's very famous because after 1948, State of Israel was established, this wasn't part of Israel, it was part of Jordan. It's where these Jewish communities were. But you could see from the border, if you looked into this area, you could see this oak tree. So everybody always saw the lone oak, and that's where our community used to be. So you could go to the border and you could see where your community or where your relatives had lived. So those communities today have been reestablished since 1967, the Gush Etzion communities. There was the old city of Jerusalem. This is the Jewish part of Jerusalem, of the old city, before 1948. Many Jews lived in the old city then. It was destroyed in 1948 and leveled by the Jordanians, and the people there were obviously were not able to stay there and had to flee. That's a girl fleeing from her home, and this is a section of the Jewish quarter when it was destroyed, and an old man there that was from the Jewish quarter. Of course, that's David Ben-Gurion. It's not my father, if anybody my father. But very interesting what he put in his diary on the day of the establishment of the State of Israel. Actually, it doesn't really say a lot about the Declaration of Independence. There was so much else going on for survival that that was just almost like an afterthought in his day. In the morning, the Gush Etzion communities were destroyed. They had the reading of the Declaration of Independence, and immediately because they were being attacked. So he wrote, at 1 p.m. the National Council met. The text of the Declaration of Independence was approved. At 1 o'clock, 4 o'clock, at 4 o'clock, independence was declared. The country went wild with joy, but as of on November 29th, I refrained from rejoicing. The state was established. Our fate now rests in the hands of the defense forces, probably not just in the hands of the defense forces, as we know. Immediately after the ceremony, I returned to military headquarters and discussed the worsening situation. So it was a very desperate situation, and really it was a miracle that the state pulled through. And then the greater miracle too is what we've just been talking about, how all these refugees came. How does a nation that is so small, so new, just developing an economy and all the things that a nation needs, absorb tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of refugees coming from places, coming with nothing, coming with like a manuscript, a little bag, nothing, right? All these people left billions of dollars in value behind them that they couldn't bring. Jews from Europe coming from the Holocaust with nothing. So all those people had to be given housing, had to be taught Hebrew, had to become a part of society and be able to have jobs. Absolutely mammoth task for a country that really didn't have anything. So to begin with, the nation was secular. Ben-Gurion was secular, Eliezer ben Yehuda, Theodor Herzl, all these early Zionists were secular men, and the state was founded on a secular basis. I mentioned this man called Rabbi Kook. He was the exception. So he was chief rabbi of Israel early on, and he had a yeshiva at Jerusalem, and he saw things differently. And the reason that he's important really is because his ideas form the basis for what today is called religious Zionism. We're going to talk about what that is because it is a phenomenon, an idea, and a way of thinking that is shaping the nation of Israel today. But in 1948, this is Rabbi Kook's son, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda, and this is what he said, and it's very interesting what he said recounting when the State of Israel was declared. So he says, on the night when news of the United Nations decision in favor of the reestablishment of the State of Israel reached us, so I guess this is the UN vote 1947, right? November 1947. When the people streamed into the streets to celebrate and rejoice, I could not go out and join in the jubilation. I sat alone and silent, a burden lay upon me. During those first hours, I could not resign myself to what had been done. I could not accept the fact that indeed they have divided my land. Isn't that amazing? That's and when you look at the partition plan, right? They divided the land. They parted the land. And so as a person who was religious, to reconcile that idea, the land has been divided, even though we might be happy because there's a nation of Israel, but the land has been divided. God's land has been divided. And he says, the next day, this other rabbi came to our house, and he felt the need to come, and how could he not come? We sat together, the two of us, in that small hallowed room, he says, in Beit Harav, which is his father's yeshiva that we just saw the picture of. Where else, if not there, we sat shocked and silent. Finally, regaining our strength, we said, the two of us as one, this is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. So the idea is that you come to, and which I guess is the same idea we had, is that this is a step forward. Right? This doesn't happen. The kingdom of God doesn't just come all of a sudden as a complete thing. It comes in stages. And so you recognize that even though this wasn't perfect, this is God's hand. And so everything with the nation of Israel, we look at the nation of Israel, it's not perfect. There's many flaws in the nation of Israel. There's many people that still don't believe in God, yet it's moving forward in God's plan. And so it is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So he goes on to say, the question has been asked, is this the state that our prophets envisioned? And I say, this is the state that the prophets envisioned. Of course, it has not yet attained perfection. But our prophets, our sages, and those who followed them said, the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will return and will reestablish settlement and independent political rule in the land. We were not told whether those who would return will or will not be men and women of righteousness. So the difference here, if you can see those two views, the one view of the religious Jews before the war and up and until World War II was completely against the reestablishment of the land of Israel, of the resettlement of the land of Israel as a secular movement, and they couldn't accept it. Then this idea came, and it came from Rabbi Kook and then his son, and then others, that, okay, this might be secular Jews that have done this. This might be not perfect. This may, is this the state that the prophets envisioned? And then they said, yes, it's a step. This is moving toward the redemption of Israel. So that you can see there's a very big difference now between those two ideas. Because the one says, the state of Israel is not part of God's plan. The other idea says, the state of Israel is absolutely part of God's plan, and this is moving forward in a process. So those are the two ideas, and those two ideas are very important. And the one, which is this idea, has really taken off today in Israel. So we're going to be looking at that as we go through our class. So this is looking at some different reactions to the establishment of the state of Israel. And this is the Vatican reaction on the day the state of Israel was proclaimed in 1948. Modern Zionism is not the true heir of biblical Israel, but a secular state. Therefore, the Holy Land and its sacred sites belong to Christianity, the true Israel. See what the question is? The question is who's the true Israel? Is it us, the Catholic Church, or is it the state of Israel? And then they said, well, obviously the state of Israel has nothing to do with God's plan because it's a secular state. That can't be it, right? So you can see how the Vatican's reasoning on that question. The same rabbi that we were just quoting, this is what he said. He says, when the flag of the state of Israel was raised, all of the Vatican's doctrines of the outcast, miserable Jews collapsed. We returned to our land, and it became clear that the eternal one of Israel will not lie. The idea that the Jewish people were a persecuted, dispersed people because they had killed God, and they would always be like that, was proved wrong, he says, when the Jews came back to their land again and God's promises were fulfilled. That is the conflict today. That's why the Vatican, this is incredible, the Vatican did not recognize the state of Israel until 1993, when the Oslo Accords were signed. one of the last people in the world to recognize the state of Israel. They want to make a Palestinian Arab state, right, in the land of Israel. Who is the first in the world to recognize that state? The Vatican. Who is the first to have an embassy for that state is in Vatican City. Who was the most frequent visitor to John Paul II of world leaders? Yasser Arafat. There's a very fascinating story that is going on here as well. Here's what the Christadelphian magazine said in 1948 when the State of Israel was established. The emergence of the people as a nation once more is a sign of the Messiah's approach, for it is one stage more in the reintegration of the dry bones of Israel. Though the throne of David was overturned in the reign of Zedekiah, and shall be no more until he come whose right it is, the Jews are now in a position which may be compared with that under the Hasmonean rulers just after the time of the Maccabees, right? Coming up to the time of Christ. Sort of like an independence. So that's a very good assessment that the Christadelphians had, I think, of what happened. This was a huge step forward in the bones coming together. An epic milestone in God's plan. And that's how we saw it as a community. And so then we were looking at the beginning of the Jews returning from Arab lands. Here's a map that shows that from Morocco, from Algeria, from Libya, from Egypt, from Yemen and Aden, from Iraq, from Iran, from Syria, from Lebanon, from Tunisia. All those Jews came back to the land from 1948 until 1967. This is pretty fascinating. I think a Jewish guy, I'll show you a video clip of him later on today. He pointed this out. So Isaiah 43 verse 6 says, I will say to the north, give up, and to the south, keep not back. Bring my sons from far and my daughters from the ends of the earth. And he said, think about how the Jews came back. The Jews of Russia, God had to say to them, give up. They had to fight to come out. They had trouble coming back. And to the south, keep not back. Bring my sons from far and my daughters from the ends of the earth. So the Jews of America and that, he said, they were gathered back. God is bringing them back in a different way. And I hadn't thought about that before. But so from the ends of the earth, the Jews came back. And what an amazing fulfillment that was of prophecy. This is a lady called Sharon Katz. She lives in Efrat, which is right next to Bethlehem, in what today would be known as the West Bank in Israel. Very actually close, I think what would be considered Gush Etzion, where that tree was, is where she lives. A few years ago, I had the privilege of going around with my father, and we traveled around the West Bank, and we interviewed different people. And this is one of the people that we interviewed about why do you live here and why did you move here. And what she's going to relate is a very simple story, but it's the reason that her and her husband left the exile and went to live in Israel. So they were in Netanya at an amusement park when this took place, and it had to do with their kids and some other kids on the Ferris wheel. So we're going to try this sound thing out here and see if it works.
And the man started the Ferris wheel, and the Ferris wheel, packed with Ethiopian children and my children, was going around and around, and the children were like waving and screaming, and I was waving the baby's hand, and my husband was so excited. And at the exact same time, we looked at each other and we said, we gotta live here. And that was because we saw, both of us, at the exact same moment, that the prophecies of our past, of our heritage, of our prophets were coming true. That just like Hashem, God promised that he would gather the Jewish people together from the four corners of the earth, it was happening right in front of our faces. We were so excited by this. We always knew that it was true, but when you see it right there in front of you, when you see the proof that God's prophecies really are true, it's such an overwhelming moment, and we said we just have to be part of the eternity of the Jewish people. We're leaving the exile, and we're going to start a new life here.
And so there it is, brothers and sisters. A visual demonstration of, like in that picture we saw, the Ethiopian Jews and the Yemenite kids and all these kids together, like different color skin from all over the world, all come together speaking Hebrew. So her and her husband are at an amusement park, and all these kids are on the Ferris wheel, and her husband paid for some Ethiopian kids to go on. And all of a sudden they're looking at this and going, these kids are from all over the world, from all these different places, and they've come together and they're speaking the same language, and the bones have come together. This is it. We want to be part of the fulfillment of prophecy, and we're going to the land of Israel. Absolutely incredible. As we're going to see, that's exactly what God said it would be like. This is another man that we had the privilege of going to visit. His name is Katzela, Yaakov Katz. So that's Jacob, right? Jacob, Yaakov. And he founded the modern-day community of Bethel, and he lost his leg in the Yom Kippur War. He said, I was blown in two pieces, and they got him out on a helicopter, and so he lost his leg. So he laughs and he says, I'm Jacob, and I founded the modern-day community of Bethel, and I'm lame in one leg. So he's a fascinating guy, and when we interviewed him, he was a member of Parliament. And so a very influential man. He started if you ever look at IsraelNationalNews.com, he founded that news outfit and had a radio station, and they wouldn't give him a license because as we'll look at, there's a war between secular and between people who say this is a fulfillment of prophecy and believe in God, and this was his viewpoint. So he had a boat, and I got to tell the story, but so he had this boat, and they would broadcast from the boat. The boat was outside of Israel waters in international waters. So they're broadcasting from international waters into the land of Israel from the boat. So the government doesn't want him to have his boat. So the government extends the international waters of Israel, so he has to push out more. So they extend out, so he's still broadcasting. He's still able to broadcast, but he's further out, and then they extend the international waters again, so that he can't broadcast, and eventually they made it so he couldn't broadcast anymore. So he's laughing. He says, now they found oil and gas. He said they can thank Katzela because of my radio station. They kept having to get more international, extending the waters of Israel, so I couldn't have my boat. So he said they can thank me for that. So let's see what he has to say. I'll get this off.
The God took us step by step, and he said, I promised you that I will bring you back to your original language, to your original places, to your original Bible locations.
Yeah.
And here I promised, and I did my job. All of a sudden, you see Jewish people speaking Hebrew. Jews started to move to Eretz Israel in the beginning, few. Today we have Jews from all over the world, from Ethiopia, from Russia, from Asia, from Sin, from Mongolia, from South Africa, from America, from Canada. How come? A guy waking up one day, no communication, no internet, no telephone, no cellular phone, nothing. Something inside. The God gave, all of a sudden he started to ring inside. Something ring. He said, hey, like animals slept, like the bear sleeping in the forest in Alaska, 6 months, 7 months, and all of a sudden something waking him up and said, hey, beautiful bear, the time arrived, you have to eat something, you have to go out, something like that, and he starting to move out from his place, from under the ground, and he starting to look for food after 6 months of sleeping. So we have slept almost 2,000 years, and all of a sudden we woke up.
Isn't that amazing, brothers and sisters? A member of Parliament who sees that my people came back from the four corners of the earth, that it was a fulfillment of prophecy, and says, my people were asleep for 2,000 years, and just like the bear in Alaska who's been hibernating, all of a sudden we were waking up. He says, how is it that a Jew in Yemen and a Jew in Europe and a Jew in Russia and a Jew in New York and everywhere else in the world, that around the same time everybody gets this idea? He says they don't even have communication with each other, and yet at the same time the Jews started coming back from the four corners of the earth. So he says it's God has given something inside to ring, to wake up, right? And so God woke up, and he's waking up the people and bringing them back to their land again. Very, very, very interesting. So let's just, in the few minutes we have left, let's just turn to Ezekiel 37 because we will be referring to it. We have been referring to it already. We looked at some of the structure of it. This is the breakdown of those 14 verses. And I think it's very, very helpful and very useful to see the structure of that prophecy, because otherwise it can get mixed up in your mind. So in verses 1 and 2, it describes the scene as it was when the prophet first sees it. The valley full of very dry bones. They were very dry. So, and then in verse 3, there's the challenge that we talked about to Ezekiel. Can these bones live? And Ezekiel answered, oh God, only you know that. So that's the challenge. Then there's an overview of what would happen in verses 4 to 6. So this is a command to the prophet, and it's what is going to happen. He said unto me, prophesy upon these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord God unto these bones, behold, I will cause breath, which is the word spirit, ruach, to enter into you, and ye shall live, and I will lay sinews upon you, and will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath or spirit in you, and you shall live, and ye shall know that I am the Lord. So that's what's going to happen. It's the command to the prophet, but it's the whole process explained there in verses 4 to 6. God says to Ezekiel, this is what you're going to do, and this is the command that you're going to give. In verses 7 and 8, we have the first prophesying. So the prophesying is divided into two stages. So verses 7 and 8 is the first one. I prophesied as I was commanded in those verses 4 to 6. So I prophesied as I was commanded, and as I prophesied there was a noise, a voice, and behold a shaking, and the bones came together, bone to his bone. And when I beheld, lo, the sinews and the flesh came up upon them, and the skin covered them above, but there was no breath, no spirit in them. No spiritual life is what I believe that the prophet is saying. So that's the first stage, and we've witnessed that stage by and large completed, I believe, in what we've seen as a community from the beginnings of Zionism until now. That has been accomplished. Verse 9 is then the second prophesying. And he said unto me, prophesy unto the wind, and it's different. Notice he prophesies unto the wind, to, again, the Spirit. Prophesy, Son of Man, and say to the wind, thus saith the Lord God, come from the four winds, O Spirit, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. And so I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived, and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great army. So that is what's going to happen when spiritual life comes into that nation. And then verses 11 to 14 is the interpretation of the prophecy. So it tells us what the bones are. These bones are the whole house of Israel. It explains to us how it was again at the beginning when the bones were dried and they were scattered in the valley. And they said, our bones are dried, our hope is lost, we are cut off from our parts. That was the beginning of it. And it's the nation of Israel that's scattered. Verse 12, therefore prophesy and say unto them, thus saith the Lord God, behold, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel. So that's the regathering. The graves are the place where the bones are scattered, and he's going to take the bones out of the graves, the countries where they've been dispersed, and he's going to bring the bones to the land of Israel. I will bring you to the land of Israel, and you shall know, notice this, you shall know that I am the Lord when I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you up out of your graves. So God says, you're going to know when I've opened your graves and I've brought you to the land of Israel, you're going to know that I'm God. And that's exactly what that lady, Sharon Katz, that's exactly what she said. She said, we were here at the playground and we saw the Jewish children from all over the world gathered together and we knew there was a God and this was true. And Yaakov Katz said, the Jews were asleep and they woke up and they've come back to the land of Israel from the four corners of the earth. And therefore I know that there's a God. And that's exactly what's happening today in Israel, as we'll continue to see as we go through our classes, that there is a spiritual awakening to this idea in the land of Israel. We've already talked about that, actually a little earlier on, about the bones represent the whole body of Israel, so we won't go through that again. So what we have here is 3 stages that I've outlined in Ezekiel 36, 37, and 37 of the ingathering of the people, as we've been looking at, of the bones coming together, taking them from among the countries and bringing them to the land of Israel. And then a national body being formed. And in our next class, God willing, we're going to look at Ezekiel 36, verse 26. I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh and will give you a heart of flesh. So there's a body that's given a new heart. So a body's formed. That's what we see in Ezekiel 37, the body being formed. And then later in the prophecy of the 2 sticks being made into one nation upon Israel. The third stage is that spiritual life comes into them. So in Ezekiel 36, it talks about, I will put my spirit within you, and you will live, and I will be your God. And you can read through those other prophecies of restoration and see that spiritual life coming into them. In Ezekiel 37, that second stage of prophesying, of the breath coming into them and them living. And in the Ezekiel 37, the latter part, the prophecy of the 2 sticks, I will cleanse them and I will make a covenant with them. That new covenant that we read about in Jeremiah as well. So I didn't expect this class to be this long, but I have a very exciting video clip for you to watch to close with. This man that we're going to see, his name is Jeremy Gimpel, and you can find his videos on YouTube. He has a thing called the Land of Israel Network, and he's a very good speaker, and he's going to talk about what we've been talking about in our class here. So let's listen to what he has to say. Maybe.
You know, my grandfather in 1916, when he was 15 years old, walked from Russia to Israel. It was with him and another handful of teenagers, the ages between 15 and 20. The last person we know on my family tree is my grandfather, Mordechai, his grandfather. His name was Zev. And as I flew here to Toronto, I had this thought. I was like, you know, what would it be like if I brought my grandfather's grandfather, Zev, who was in Bialystok, to Ben Gurion Airport today? He would see black Jews from Ethiopia and brown Jews from Morocco and Yemen and tall blonde Jews with blue eyes from Russia and American Jews and Canadian Jews and South American Jews, and all of them would be speaking Hebrew. And Zev didn't know Hebrew, he spoke Yiddish and Russian. And then he would see an IDF soldier walking by, and I'm sure he'd get nervous because if you ever saw a soldier in Russia, that was usually not a good sign for the Jews. And then as the soldier turned, he would see a blue Jewish star on his shoulder, the flag of Israel. I have no doubt that at that moment, just in Ben Gurion Airport, he would turn to me and be like, well, where is he? I'd be like, well, where is who? It's like, well, where's Mashiach? He must be here. And he wouldn't be wrong for asking that. We are so close to the dreams and hopes that we've been waiting for 2,000 years, wherever we were, whatever happened the night before. Walking in Yerushalayim now, seeing the children, it's like we are the answered prayers of our fathers and mothers for so many generations back. We're like the living answers to their prayers. We're their dreams realized in our reality.
Absolutely incredible, brothers. This is for a Jew today to recognize the fulfillment of prophecy on the hand of God in that way, and to recognize, where is the Messiah? Where is Moshiach? Where is he? Because look at everything that's happened. Why isn't he here yet? And he says he wouldn't be wrong to ask that question. And that's how close we are to the return of Christ. When a Jew's telling us that this is how close we are, we should know that too. So that's Ezekiel 37. Behold, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel, and ye shall know that I am the Lord. And we see that developing today. Thank you.
Well, thank you.